What separates a safety culture from a company that just has policies on paper?
There really is no such thing as a safety culture that's somehow independent from the company's overall culture. So when we think about
Meet Brian Fielkow, Executive Vice President of Risk Resources at Acrisure and consultant, professional speaker, and author at Brian Fielkow and Associates, also the author of Making Safety Happen, with more than 30 years of executive leadership experience. He believes safety isn't just a policy.
Safety culture only works if it reaches the people doing the work every day. What does it take to make safety personal for frontline employees?
safety has to start in the heart. To make safety personal, we've got to remember this is about getting you home to your family safely. This is about people. Everything starts with leadership. People will say that, well, in order to have safe outcomes, you have to have clear systems and processes. And that's completely accurate. That's totally true.
How does leadership train people to operate from their safety standards?
The most important thing on getting the organization to understand safety processes is
Safety is easy to talk about when nothing's going wrong. The real test is what happens when pressure builds, shortcuts become tempting, and people are counting on every decision being the right one. Real safety culture isn't checking boxes. Real safety culture is what an organization does when nobody's watching, and whether everyone from the boardroom to the shop floor is aligned around the same standard. Pull up a chair. I'm your host, Alexander Boehm. Let's talk about it. Today, we're talking about what it takes to build a true safety culture, one that goes beyond compliance and holds up under real-world pressure. In industries like chemical logistics, safety isn't a box to check. It has to be part of how a company thinks, leads, and operates at every level. Brian Fielkow is the author of Making Safety Happen and a nationally recognized business leader with more than 30 years of hands-on executive experience in safety-sensitive industries. He is also the perfect guest to discuss today's topic of building a safety culture beyond compliance alone. Welcome to Talk About. Brian, let's get into it. Well, thank you, Brian, for joining me today for this episode of Talk About. Let's dive right in. When you say safety culture, what are you actually talking about? What separates a safety culture from a company that just has policies on paper?
I'm glad you asked that question, Alex, because we use the term safety culture. Even in my book, I'll use the term safety culture to talk about safety-specific aspects of a culture. But if we take a step back, in my mind, there really is no such thing as a safety culture that's somehow independent from the company's overall culture. So when we think about company culture or safety culture, it's driven by the same thing. It's driven by leadership. It's driven by employee engagement. It's driven by very clear, robust systems and understandable processes. It's driven by accountability. Those things go into are the elements of a healthy company culture, and a safety culture is just a subset of company culture. I mean, can you imagine a company operating safely on a consistent basis if the company culture is broken? I think it's impossible. By the same token, a very healthy company could have some safety problems. That's part of being in business, but that company can overcome the problems, address them, and become smarter and stronger because of them, because all the aspects of the culture are in place. So when I talk about safety culture, and I do, I'm really talking about the same aspects that drive overall company culture, because safety, productivity, and ultimately profitability are all one and the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting view. In your book, Making Safety Happen, you make a point that safety is often not a priority. Why is the distinction between safety being not a core value so important?
Yeah, I don't get hung up a lot on words, but in this case, I really do think words matter. And the reason I like to say safety is not a priority is because priorities shift. I mean, look, you could come to your office today with 10 things to do. Prioritize, number 1 through 10. And the phone rings, and you've got a problem with a customer. There's a service issue. Whatever the issue is, you just rearranged your priorities, right? And that's the joy of being in business. Priorities shift, they can shift, they do shift, they compete with each other. So if safety is a priority in my mind, that means that other things like production demands can compete for safety. On the other hand, if we say safety is a core value, what we're telling our team is that our values are immutable. Nothing can compete for our values. So a lot of companies will say our values are integrity, respect, teamwork. So if integrity is a core value and we have a customer problem, we're going to deal with it honestly. We're not going to compromise our integrity and tell the customer something that's not true. Well, that's where safety belongs, is that I don't care what the production pressure is. I don't care how far behind we are on a project. We're not going to allow that pressure to compete for safety. It's non-negotiable. That's where leaders have to define safety and place safety in the organization, is that we're going to have problems along the way. We're going to have challenges along the way. We get that. That's part of being in business, but not at the expense of safety. Because I've just seen too often where, we're running late, so let's just speed. Let's just go fast, right? That's where production and safety can conflict. And ultimately, we realize that the safest companies, have the opportunity to be the most productive because they're not spending their time, or they're spending less time, cleaning up the mess. But it all starts with priorities versus values. And it all starts with not allowing anything to compete for safety.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you, Brian, on that. Let's take a look into frontline engagement. The safety culture only works if it reaches the people doing the work every day. What does it take to make safety personal for frontline employees?
Well, I think the word in your question really is personal, right? In other words, if safety is just policies and signs on the wall, it's hard to get people to engage. So safety has to start in the heart. So to make safety personal, we've got to remember that this is about getting you home to your family safely. This is about people. This is about putting you first, right? We prioritize your health and well-being above everything else. So we can talk about the finances, we can talk about insurance, we can talk about process, but when you're talking to your frontline employees, none of that really matters if they don't feel a personal connection. And quite frankly, people have to see the implications of the opposite, right? In other words, sure, can I make a phone call while I'm driving and get away with it? Probably, until my luck runs out. And people have to understand the consequences, the personal consequences of that bad decision, of the shortcuts, of the workarounds and process, because it all comes back to personal. It all comes back to the lives of your employees and comes back to the lives of members of the public, people you'll never meet. So it has to be made personal. But how do we engage people? In other words, how do we make it personal? For me, it has to do with including people in process design and giving your front lines a voice. I mean, look, I've been guilty of this in the past, and I hope I've learned over the years, but sometimes the smartest people are not the ones sitting around the conference room table. You've got to bring in your subject matter experts, because then they have ownership. Then they've got a vested interest. So, my years at Jetco, as we matured, as the company evolved, we brought our drivers into process design. You could have all the process in the world, but if it's not practical, it's not going to do any good. So, the more we brought them in, the more they owned it. So part of making safety personal is making sure people have a vested stake and ownership and input, that leaders are really willing to listen, because your subject matter experts truly are your front lines.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're 100% right when you're saying, that bringing in the most knowledgeable employees that are actually the ones that are executing the work is very crucial. That's also a great segue into the next question. How do the best organizations get buy-in from the shop floor instead of just handing down rules from leadership?
Well, a good example of that, from my personal experience, is when we made a decision to install dual-facing cameras in our trucks. And we did it when it was fairly early for fleets our size. I mean, by the by the 2014, 15, larger fleets had done that, but I would say that a very small percentage of our competitors in that mid-sized niche had done that. So it involved process change, right? And we knew that if we got it wrong, at the time, our drivers had a lot of places they could go work without the camera. So, it wasn't like a theoretical concern. It was like, we know we need to do this. We know that cameras protect the company and they protect the driver, but how do you get the buy-in? So we made a commitment not to implement change like, wake up Monday morning and you got cameras in your truck. We put a beta group together. And the beta group, we tried to recruit people in the beta group, some people that we thought understood the idea and would like it, others that, we knew would hate the idea. Diversity of opinions, diversity of experience, background. And we ran the cameras with the beta group for maybe 90 days. And in that 90 days, people saw the vision, right? They got, things that they might have been ticketed for got ripped up. We were able to show, I remember one crash where we were able to show the officer the video in real time. And without that footage, my guess is the driver would have been found liable. And the driver started to realize that the cameras truly did protect them, their driving record, which, is publicly available if they want, with MVRs or your PSP scores, your safety profile, that they realized it protected them. So the idea to get the buy-in is bring them into the change process where possible. Not possible every time, but that's what worked for us, because by the time we rolled the cameras out, it was our beta group doing the rollout, not me, not our executive team. So bringing them in and listening to some of the concerns, like I said before, involve them where you can in process design because they are your subject matter experts. Then another way to get buy-in is that, making sure that how you implement process is fair, it's reasonable, it's understandable. I think that's a lot of times where we run into problems, because I may think the process is clear, I may think it's understandable, but that may not be the case among our drivers. A good example is we had, one of our very strict rules that can really cause trouble for the employees. If you're on a permit load, meaning you're on an oversized or overweight load and you're on a specific route, you don't deviate from that route. Well, that seems like a pretty clear process and a pretty common sense process. Really good, except what happens when you get somewhere and that route is closed? Then what? Right? So you have to sort of live the world that your frontline employees are living in, the ones who have to execute on the process, and make sure that it's reasonable. Otherwise, you're asking them to buy into something that looks good on paper, but not the real world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Great examples. I still remember 10 years ago when we started the implementation of the camera system, which you had mentioned early, and definitely employee buy-in was crucial for the success of this program. And it really has very positive effects in the long run. Going back and talk about the connection between leadership intent and frontline behavior. Where do companies usually lose that connection?
It's lost in the suggestion box. We don't want suggestion boxes because, the suggestions don't get followed up on sometimes. So look, I'm going to give you an example from, the world we both have lived in, which is logistics and trucking. If we're doing our job and we're busy, our drivers aren't there a lot of the time. And so that physical distance can erode connection. So what we did at Jetco, and this isn't a driver thing, this is something people could take and doesn't matter your industry, but our drivers elected what we called our driver committee. Very careful here to say not a safety committee, because it was more holistic than a safety committee. A safety committee just focused on safety. The driver committee focused on the life of a driver in the company, safety being a part of it. And that's how we preserved and grew the connection, because we knew that we couldn't necessarily reach out to every one of our drivers, and we knew that some didn't necessarily want to reach out to management. But what the driver committee did, because once we formed that driver committee and they were elected by the drivers, they weren't appointed by us, we didn't make a move affecting the life of a driver at the company. unless we had the input of the committee or at least the chairman of the committee. That created connection. That committee basically was the missing piece between the office, if you will, and our drivers. It gave our drivers a voice and a process by which that voice could be heard so that it wasn't random, and it created a level of trust and a level of engagement that we hadn't had before. And I can point to turnover numbers, I can point to safety numbers, I can point to customer satisfaction after that committee was formed and operationalized, because we did our best to make our drivers owners, our frontline employees owners. And the more they became owners, the more connected they felt. And quite frankly, it was great for our management and office team too, because there was a different level of camaraderie from which really important conversations came.
Yeah, that makes sense. In the very beginning of our conversation, you alluded to accountability. So let's look a little bit more into this area. How do you create accountability without turning safety into a finger pointing game?
When I speak, I'll always give a disclaimer, like, make sure that whatever I say, I'm not giving you legal advice, talk to your lawyer. And then what I'll do is I'll jump into progressive discipline, which, a lot of lawyers like to talk about. And progressive discipline to me is the best way to create a finger pointing game. Do you want to have a blame culture or a just culture? And the way that a lot of us were taught to implement progressive discipline, which may or may not be right, but maybe the first violations are a verbal warning and then a written warning, and then strike 3 is something else, and strike 4 ultimately leading to termination. And that erodes trust. And quite frankly, if I was holding myself to a standard where I got a strike for every mistake I made, I probably should have fired myself in the first week. I mean, we hold our frontline employees to a standard that we can't ever meet. So a way to infuse accountability without a finger pointing game is a concept called just culture. And what you do there is you look at the incident or the service failure, the production failure, whatever it is. And the thing I would ask is, was this an honest mistake, or was it deliberate, intentional, reckless behavior? And the reality is most of these failures, again, safety, service, whatever they are, have their roots in honest mistakes. And you handle that one way. You handle that with coaching. You handle that with, reviewing your systems. Was the person properly trained? What could the organization have done better? What could the employee have done better? You're sitting side by side, not across the table with some disciplinary mentality. Now, if it was reckless behavior, somebody decides to go, 50 miles an hour through a well-marked school zone, I'm not waiting for strike 2. I'm sorry. So to me, the more you can distinguish what went into it will help you build a stronger organization. You'll build trust. I'm not saying don't document the coaching, document the discipline, but a blame culture seeks to blame the employee. Who done it? Whose hands were on the wheel, no matter what. A just culture, on the other hand, looks at the context in which it happened. It looks for systemic contributors, it looks for individual contributors, and it looks to continuously improve, saving blame for the deliberate, intentional misconduct, which honestly does it happen? Of course it does, but it's rare.
Yeah, absolutely agree to that.
If a lot of it is happening, I think you've got other things to talk about, right?
Yeah, definitely. In your mind, what should executives, managers, and frontline leaders each be responsible for when it comes to safety?
Yeah, that's a great question. Early in my career, I was taught that safety is behavior based, right? So that the employee's behavior dictates safe outcomes. And well, that's sort of true, because especially when your employees are remote, working all over the country, all over the world, sure, your employees have to conduct themselves accordingly. They've got to do the right things when nobody's looking. But we have to realize, and this is where the executive comes in, that behavior is often a product of the system in which employees operate. So the executive has to create the environment. And That means setting the expectations. That means leading by example. That means creating the culture, as we talked about earlier. And really, nobody can lead that other than your executives, because they're the standard bearers that everybody looks to. The executives cast the giant shadow. I mean, I'll joke again with, we do our training about distracted driving, but, if the executives are leaving the office on their cell phone, well, they're leading by example. All the training, you might as well not have done the training, right? You just undermined it all. So you have to be mindful as an executive of the shadow that you cast and the environment you create. I go back to the driver example but really the example could apply to any employee, but the drivers have a particular pre-hire opportunity where you can look at a driver's, it's called their personal safety profile, as you're aware, and you can look at their PSP and look at their violations pre-hire to see if you want to really bring that person on board. And we would bring on drivers that had issues on their PSP. We didn't get perfect PSP scores. But if I saw somebody that couldn't control their speed, I knew that probably wasn't our driver. But if I saw maintenance violations and I knew where they were coming from, these are people that may want to upgrade. I want to work for a better employer. So executives need to control who they let in the door. Sometimes you need to hire a lot of people at once because you're busy, you maybe have some turnover, maybe you've got a new project. But executives need to make sure that they've got to be sure that the system's in place to guard the gates, so that the people coming in are not just technically competent. We can do a skills test and understand that, but they've got to be value aligned. And where that really conflicts, where you really get the tension, is when I've got to get people in here, right? And, you can wind up letting some people in that may pass a skills test, but may cost you a lot more in the long run because they just don't operate and don't want to operate in accordance with the environment that you as executives created. So I think that's what executives have to do, is be the standard bearer. And then, managers are in a way sometimes caught in the middle, right? Because you've got the C-suite, the executive level intent is here. The operational realities are somewhere else. Frontline perceptions are somewhere else. And so it can be very frustrating for managers, for supervisors, because they're the ones that have to execute on the intent in the reality. So the best thing the managers can do, and this I've seen them do very well, but I've also seen them struggle, is they've got to communicate. They've got to be able to be comfortable talking to the executives, saying, look, I know what you want. Here are the barriers. And until we can remove the barriers, we're going to have a hard time implementing that. There has to be transparency. Look, a lot of times I'll speak to people, and maybe it's an operations or safety manager who says, well, I get it, but my CEO doesn't, So my reply will be, what are you going to do about that then? Right? Because I get it, if my CEO doesn't, could make for a real frustrating relationship. And the advice I'll give managers to help execute on safety is that if they need to escalate something to the C level to kind of close a gap, if it's an emergency, all bets are off. Just walk in, right? But if it's not an emergency, ask for an appointment. Before the appointment, give me the time to prepare. Show me what you want to talk about. And by all means, do not come to me with a bunch of problems you're going to leave on my desk for me to fix. I want to know what you think as a manager. I want to know how you're going to solve it. So if you make a time for us to talk, if you give me a preview, if you kind of let me see the problem so I can do my homework, and then you give me what you would do as solutions, whether I agree with that or not doesn't matter. I want to know what you're thinking. I think that's ways that the manager has to, it's called managing up. That's the way that a manager has to kind of manage, if you will, their executives. And as far as frontline leaders, I talked a little bit about the driver committee, the committee idea, but it goes beyond that. Really, the best thing a frontline leader can do, and I like the way you use the word leader, because there's titles, right, with CEO, president, vice president, but leadership has little to do with the title. I mean, you can have a great leader in your front lines, because in order for me to be respected as a leader, how I show up, it's what my peers think of me. So a great executive happens to be a great leader, But you could have a great leader in your organization who doesn't have that kind of title. Those people are on your front lines. That's the power that you want to harness. But the most important thing we can think about for frontline employees is peer-to-peer accountability. So we think about accountability, like we said before, the old school progressive discipline, manager to employee. But who's going to see the issue first, right? And who's going to see the opportunity for improvement first? Well, two peers, two similarly situated employees working side by side. So peer-to-peer accountability, you have to be courageous, and you have to have the confidence to say something to your coworker, because you're not, or in the organization chart, you're not necessarily above them in the org chart, you're a peer. So a frontline employees, the best thing they can do is train peer-to-peer. The best thing they can do is when they see somebody doing something that's either unsafe or not in line with process, if we assume that most mistakes like that are honest mistakes, take time to coach them, take time to kind of show them the right way. Frontline leaders can be the standard bearer for taking your processes, systems and processes, and weaving them into reality. So each has an important role, the executive, the manager, and the frontline teams. I hope I gave you a little flavor for what each could do.
Absolutely. Thank you for that really great insight. And I think the big question at the end of that accountability piece here is, how do you know whether accountability is actually working inside an organization?
I take a more holistic view to measure. So in other words, I really believe that you have a set of data, you've got a set of lagging indicators. So in order to know whether accountability is working, or whether your culture is working for that matter, what are the lagging indicators and leading indicators you choose to measure? I mean, a lot of times lagging indicators are based on things that happened in the past, your profit and loss statement, your insurance losses, your compliance scores, whether it's OSHA or DOT or whatever the compliance scores are. Those are all lagging indicators. They're all, yesterday. And they're important because we have to learn from history. But you also have to, in terms of judging whether it's working, is what are your leading indicators? And are we, for example, if training on a given topic is required by a certain group, is everybody attending? And if you're not attending mandatory training, what's the consequence? Why not? There can be no excuse, because you know as well as I do, Murphy's Law will tell you that the person that blew off the training is going to be the person that is going to have the issue. So leading indicators, for example, are daily safety briefings, job hazard analysis, job safety, job hazard analysis, pre-shift walkarounds. When you're starting a new project, a more detailed briefing on, okay, this may look like the same kind of business that we've done, but no, here, this is different. Going over the risks of the particular project, the new customer. I mean, every new customer you go to, the loading dock is different. The quality of the customer in terms of their ability to load you safely is different. So making sure that the people are prepared before starting new work. A lot of, I think of safety issues back in my day, and a lot of them were on a new route, right? Because, well, if you can go from point A to point B, then point C should be a no-brainer, except the route to point C has a very low bridge, right? So that just changed the whole dynamic. We checked that out. So the more you can prepare, the more you can anticipate the hazards. It doesn't need to be the sky is falling. This isn't Chicken Little. What are the main hazards? The risks that have the most potential for a serious injury or fatality. Focus on that. We don't need to go focus on every single risk in the world. I think if you can go home knowing that, we're doing our job hazard analysis, that all employees that are required to participate in training have been trained. The new work is treated as a new risk, and new work is exciting and new risks are exciting. We're not you can't eliminate a risk. It's just, have we managed the risk? Those are ways you get in front of it. And I think ultimately you're going to know based on your safety performance. The thing I would caution people against is, people will look at their compliance scores for insight into accountability. I don't really put a lot of weight into looking at, OSHA or DOT scores. I mean, like, I've seen people, because maybe bonus plans are structured on recordables, I've seen people argue over whether something is recordable. And I just think that's silly. I mean, recordable just means certain boxes were checked. How about all the near misses? How about all the things that any major crash, right? There are very few things are a shock loss. Most major incidents are really, when you do your homework and do your root cause, you find out they were a predictable surprise, not a shock loss, because all the attributes were in place. There were probably near misses that were ignored. So part of accountability is, we're not just going to go measure crashes or injuries. We're going to measure near misses, and we're going to treat a near miss as if what it could have been. That's another sign to me of an accountable organization, is that it's looking for the whispers, the things that where we just got lucky and nothing happened. A good example I like to give, it's a very tragic one, but if we remember, in January of 2025, there was this horrific crash over the Potomac involving an American Eagle jet and a military helicopter, right? It was at night. The military helicopter was flying too low, and, it was horrible. But what if I told you that the exact same set of facts happened over the Potomac over 80 times from 2011 to the date of the crash? Just happened to be that there was no crash. So what if we would have listened to that and listened to the near misses? Maybe the process could have been redesigned to avoid that horrific crash. That's what I'm talking about. That's the lessons we have to learn, is the more that we can audit our systems, audit our processes, be sure everything is working, the better chance we've got to, minimize the potential of something more significant happening.
Yeah, I absolutely are on the same page with what you just said. The learnings to prevent the bigger things from happening are really, really important. In your book, you write about hidden risks, shortcuts, and misaligned incentives, and you kind of hit a little bit on it in the last questions. What are some of the most common blind spots you see?
I'll expand on that a little bit from the last question, but let's talk first about misaligned incentives. I mean, look, I'm all in favor of incentivizing employees, but if I have, let's say, an operations executive, operations manager, who is incentivized only on production, and, it's like, let's just cut every corner and I need to make my bonus. You just got exactly what you paid for. So that's a really good example of, if all we're measuring is on-time deliveries, or if all we're measuring is production and output, and by the way, those are perfectly good metrics, but they've got to be in the context that we're doing everything else right. In other words, safety has to be a gatekeeper. That we've got to operate safely. We've got to operate within the law and within our own processes. And if we do all that, first of all, we just made it easier to be productive, because we're not hopefully lowering the chance of something, cleaning up the mess. But when you just say raw production with no guardrails around it, you got what you paid for. So that's a good example of misaligned incentives. Your drivers, here's a bonus for an on-time delivery. That doesn't work. As far as, hidden risks go, when I see safety issues at an organization, you can do a surface root cause analysis, right? Let's say you had a rear end crash. So your vehicle hit another vehicle. Well, you could say they were following too closely. You could say that they weren't controlling their speed. Those things may well be very true, okay? But those are the obvious risks. To me, the hidden risks is, are we applying undue production pressure? Tell me about training. Do we have warnings on this individual from our telematics system that we ignored? What are our hiring standards? Tell me about our maintenance process. Are we rigorous in our equipment maintenance, or do we do it when we get around to it? All those things are sort of lying beneath the surface. They may not be evident in a initial surface root cause analysis, but those hidden risks, unmanaged production pressure, etc., I think have the underlying contributors. And that's where the executive needs to make sure, when you have something that needs a root cause analysis, the executive needs to participate, to ask those questions, so that we're not just saying, okay, we figure out whose hands are on the wheels, whose hands are on the levers, write them up and move on, because all you're going to do is write the next person up. The hidden risks are the ones that I just mentioned, are examples of where I think you have to look to see what's really driving some of the dysfunctions in the company. And this is without judgment. I mean, the best companies in the world have these challenges. These are normal dysfunctions. It's whether an effective leadership team can address them or whether we let them go unchecked. And now we're cleaning up the mess, and now we're going to get serious about it. Let's get in front of it.
Yeah, totally right. In the same context, some of the examples you just brought, in terms of training, maintenance, these kind of things. Why do organizations sometimes accept good enough when the stakes are actually much higher?
It may be because they haven't yet had to deal with something really blowing up on them. I think good enough is a really dangerous place to be. Normally, if you have a good enough attitude toward safety, that may be the same attitude you have toward customer service, toward, a lot of other things. So to me, a good example is I'll see people argue over 0 as a standard when it comes to safety performance, right? In other words, 0 incidents. And you've got the good enough crowd saying, well, that's ridiculous because 0 is impossible. But to me, the most effective leaders understand that 0 is not necessarily a metric. In other words, it's not like if we don't reach 0, we failed. That's not the approach here. 0 is a mindset. It's a mindset that says, if I accept one preventable serious injury, one preventable fatality, then I'm setting myself up to accept more. A good enough mindset says, oh, that's just, some incidents, some accidents, that's just the cost of doing business. Better leadership mindset is to say, no, we're not going to accept any of them as part of the cost of doing business. Now, like I said, if you don't hit 0, it doesn't mean you've somehow failed. And for the people that think, well, that 0 mindset, that high bar is ridiculous, just, get 100 people in the room, ask them who doesn't want to go home tonight, and nobody will raise their hand. So if your team demands 0 because nobody's raising their hand, the 99% is not good enough as a mindset, as a leadership mindset. I don't understand the good enough mentality because I think it ultimately paves the way for mediocrity throughout the organization. And just to clarify, it's not to say that anything other than 0 is a failure. It's to say that we're not, as leaders, going to accept 0, and we're going to relentlessly pursue excellence in what we do.
Yeah. Can you actually share an example of one of the near misses or the whispers, as you previously called them? I really would like to hear how stopping these on paper minor safety issues can become catastrophic if not handled properly.
So, Alex, an example that you may remember from Houston is many years ago at one of the, Houston has a couple container ports and then it's got some inland ports. At one of the inland ports, a gate agent was standing behind a truck and the truck backed right into the gate agent and killed the person. And, how many times might a driver have backed into a pole or backed into a fence and just something where, you fix it and you move on? And, or a driver who may have torn up some landscape and some grass because they ran off the road. Well, if you manage things by outcome, these were clearly minor outcomes, you're never going to fix the problem. But if I can't fix the backing, if I don't teach people how to get out and look, if I don't teach situational awareness, you will draw the short straw at some point. And that I think is what happened at the port many years ago. And I think we're all vulnerable to that in terms of whatever industry we're in. So I would take this approach. Okay. I would say there's no such thing as a minor, quote unquote, minor accident if it had the potential for greater severity. So I'm certainly not suggesting we get wound up about paper cuts, but I'll give you an example. Let's say 2 employees come to you right now and both have a cut on their finger, okay? One employee, they were handling something in the office and they cut themselves. The other employee was working on a high hazard machine and there was no guarding. They both have the same cut finger, but the context is day different, right? In the office, it probably wasn't going to get any worse than needing a Band-Aid. But in the operations with the machinery, you're just lucky that you cut your finger and that you didn't lose your hand because the machine guarding was improper. So to me, it's the context that matters. So I think it has to do with treating something that had the potential to be severe as if it were severe. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to catastrophize everything. I don't want to create we've got to stop the world. But what we've got to do is make sure that we're doing training, we're doing coaching, and that we're not just saying, well, nothing bad happened, therefore we move on. That's dangerous. That's what classic ignoring the whispers is you're looking at the outcome, saying it was minor, we move on, as opposed to looking at what happened, what was its potential, and did we get lucky?
Yeah, absolutely. Also here, same page, obviously the outcome or the potential outcome is very important in these reviews. And you alluded to training, but also, missing machine guards. So a technical review is important as well from my perspective. You've worked in safety sensitive businesses for decades. What have you learned about the connection between leadership and safety performance?
They're intimately connected. Everything starts with leadership. I mean, people will say that, well, in order to have safe outcomes, you have to have clear systems and processes. And that's completely accurate. That's totally true. But if leadership isn't ensuring that people are trained to those processes, if leadership is kind of looking the other way and allowing workarounds, that's the real signal right there. So what you as a leader prioritize, what you as a leader tolerate, what you as a leader recognize and reward, the organization will follow suit. And what I find, especially with, entrepreneurial leaders, is they're focused on growth. And that's great. I mean, growth is good. But I've also seen a lot of these same entrepreneurial leaders grow, but then they give it back because they didn't manage their risk properly. So a leader's role has to make sure there's balance, that we're going to grow. We don't want to grow just for growth's sake. We want to grow profitably. And part of profitable growth means that you've got a risk management plan at the highest level in the organization, at the board of directors level. It's enterprise risk management, and safety is part of enterprise risk management. So to me, the leader understands that safety is part of robust enterprise risk management. It's not a department that's the responsibility of a safety director down the hall, right? The leader has to understand their role. If I go to a company and I ask a survey, ask a question, who's responsible for safety in the company? In a lot of cases, half are going to say the safety department or the safety manager, and the other half is going to say I am or we all are. There's only one right answer. The right answer is I am or we all are. It's not the safety director or the safety department. Those are the kinds of perceptions that leaders have to make sure that the organization understands and that they're standing behind. And that means standing behind your safety personnel and making sure that everybody knows that you've got their back.
Couldn't agree more. From your perspective, how do strong safety cultures help organizations become more resilient after incidents or setbacks?
It's when you have an incident, it's the last thing you want to talk about. It's no fun, right? But the best organizations are transparent. They're going to say what happened, and they're going to educate. They're going to use the incident as a learning experience. They're kind of perpetually curious. They're committed to continuous improvement. So if you've got an employee who's injured, right, you're not going to just say, all right, that now it's an insurance problem, going to hand it over to the claims manager and they'll take care of it. Well, you need to do that. You have to have another look at, say, okay, what happened and how do we learn from it? And we would issue safety advisories and safety alerts when something happened. Now, we never ever said, can you believe what John Smith did? Wasn't that stupid? We would never name names, but we would say that we had this situation happen, and this is something that we learned. And what the difference between the advisory and the alert, the safety alert was kind of printed in red. It meant stop what you're doing and read this. It means it was something that really could have been bad. And the idea is if everything was printed in red, then nothing is important. So we saved the safety alerts for stuff that, really needed attention now, like don't make another move till you digest this. The safety advisories were important, but we tried to communicate the two varying levels of urgency. So I think resilience has to do with communication. It has to do with looking at individual and organizational contributors to the incident. And again, perpetual curiosity and a perpetual commitment to continuous improvement.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that deep insight. What does it take to make safety part of long-term business performance, not just operational performance?
Yeah, at the executive level, I think executives, senior managers need to be tied into safety performance. I think there has to be, you could be profitable and not run safely for some period of time because insurance losses take a while to mature, litigation takes a while. So, we could have a really good year on the financial statements in 2026. Then in 2028, all these claims settle. Now 2028's performance is compromised. So to me, you have to kind of align everybody along the fact that, safety is part of what we do. It's not going to go away. It's not going to be compromised. The best example I can give you goes back many years, probably 40 years now. But Paul O'Neill took over as the CEO of Alcoa. And, later after Alcoa, he was actually the Treasury Secretary under George W. Bush. He had a very distinguished career. But in Paul O'Neill's first meeting with the investor community, he said, if you want to know how Alcoa is doing, look at our safety performance. And people ran for the door. They thought this guy was crazy. The investors wanted to know about inventory turns and margin and all that. And O'Neill came to the table with the fundamental truth that a company that's operating consistently, long-term, safely, is probably more productive and more profitable than its peers. And I forgot the exact multiple, but in O'Neill's tenure from about 1987 to about 2000, Alcoa probably went up 6 or 7 times. I mean, he took a company that was struggling, turned it around, and he was probably the most public and most visible CEO that said that safety will be the basis on which we're measured long term, because he knew that everything else would emanate from that. And I think that's the model to follow when we talk about making it part of long-term performance. And we can take comfort in the results that Paul O'Neill delivered with that approach. And, again, in my years at Jetco, safety did go from when I took it over. This was sort of my evolution too. When I took it over, I thought safety was a department, right? That's what it was, right? As long as the DOT was happy and we passed an audit, we were okay. But as I evolved, I realized there's something bigger there, that safety really is at the foundation of long-term performance. And we re-engineered the company that way, and we just got better and better because of it. Whether you want to talk about customer loyalty, customer satisfaction, service levels, driver retention, they're all related, And for us, it all started with having employees that were aligned with our core values, safety being, the dominant one.
Yeah, thank you for making the link between safety and the actual business performance. I think that is a very, very strong argument you're making. And it's really true that safety has a direct link to success. How does leadership train people to operate from their safety standards? How do they get the entire organization to understand and respect their safety processes? So how basically does leadership align an organization in terms of safety?
The most important thing on getting the organization to understand safety processes, just asking a simple question: are the processes reasonably understandable by the audience for whom they're intended? And if they're not, you don't have process, you have words on paper. So if the intended employee group reads a 7th or 8th grade level and your process manual is written at a collegiate level, I'm sorry, you can't expect them to follow that process. So I'll give you a couple thoughts there. First of all, if you're going to buy a book on this topic, there's a book out there called The Checklist Manifesto, which is absolutely my favorite book on this. In a nutshell, it's written by Dr. Atul Gawande, who was running a network of operating rooms in New York. And, they had all the process in the world. But yet people were needlessly being injured or dying on operating tables because the process wasn't followed. So he took the operating environment, saw what airline pilots did, right? Pre-trip, post-flight checklist. And he converted the operating room into a checklist environment. Before every surgery, we follow this checklist. After every, we follow that checklist. So to me, the best way to operationalize the process is, number one, be sure they're understandable. And number two, let's understand that we don't need to be taught something new every day as much as we need to be reminded. So we took that idea at Jetco, and this is an example I know that we both share very deeply, Alex, but people on the outside looking in thinking, well, what can be so hard about hauling containers, intermodal containers? Really, intermodal is one of the most complicated transactions you have out there because you're going from point A to point B to C to D. I mean, it can be very complicated. And so every touch point in an intermodal transaction creates more room for operational error. So we put together intermodal checklists for our people booking and dispatching loads. And those checklists, we had all the process before, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't necessarily followed all the time. But the checklist, you damn well better needed to follow that. And if we had an error, we would look at, was the checklist followed? And so did it eliminate error entirely? No. But did it create much greater reliability and a lot fewer errors? Absolutely. And if somebody didn't follow the checklist, well, that was a good reminder to let's not do that again. So, basically, it's not about having the process. I trust we have the process. It's about, is it operationalized? Is it ingrained? And things like checklists, to me, are the way to do that.
Absolutely agree. Well, Brian, that's going to do it for this conversation. Thank you for sharing what it really takes to build a safety culture that lasts. If people want to learn more about your work or your new book that you just released, where should they go?
The new book is called Making Safety Happen, and you can get it pretty much on any online retailer. So Amazon, Apple, Barnes and Noble. It's available in a printed book, in a ebook format, and this book I decided to do an audio book too. So however you want to consume it, the book is meant to meet people where they're at. So I wrote it the way I read, which is rarely cover to cover. So you go through the table of contents and you can find the chapters and sections that are most relevant to where you are today. And then you can refer back to it 6 months later. It's really meant to be a how-to guide with a lot of stories, a lot of checklists, things you can follow and make it simple. And it's really written for leaders. So it could be executives, it could be managers, people leading high hazard businesses. I mean, the principles in here apply. It really doesn't matter the industry. If you've got kind of safety risk, you're going to find something in the book. So that's called Making Safety Happen. My website is Brian Fielkow, BrianFielkow.com. And I've got content on there. And, my email's on there too. So you're always free to reach out to me if you have any questions or need any more information. If you're interested in a bulk purchase of the book, 10 or more, then definitely reach out to me, and pricing would be probably lower than online. But yeah, I hope, Alex, we can keep this conversation going, and I really appreciate the opportunity to join you.
And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today. And for our viewers, Brian is regularly also speaking at safety conferences, and I only can recommend to attend one of his events. It is really, really a great experience to listen to what Brian has to deliver. Thank you. If you're in Baytown, we'd love to connect in person. Reach out at info.talke.com/podcast to set that up. If you're not in Baytown, we put together something special for you. We have developed a free visibility checklist with 10 questions to ask any logistics provider before you sign. It takes about 5 minutes, and it will tell you real quick whether your current partner can actually see what's happening with your shipments. Anyone can download it for free now at info.talke.com/podcast. Until next time, I'm your host, Alexander Boehm. Thanks for joining the Talk About Podcast.